Hey Bruce, how you doing?
Great. How are you doing today, Bernie?
Good, good, good. Um, actually, it's a sad time because my just dear, close, intimate friend, Paul Bianchi, who was the headmaster at Paideia School in Atlanta, extremely progressive, vivid school. It was started by Paul and some parents and some of friends of his from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, from some other places, people in Atlanta, um, from scratch, and has become this incredibly respected institution. Now, if it was Paul was here, Paul had the best sense of humor, Bruce, I've ever seen. If he heard me say that, he would say, "Despite you, Bernie, it became very respectful." Okay. He was very funny. Um, uh, he's irreverent. He wasn't profane himself, but he loved hearing it. Okay. He could join in. And uh, the whole thing started with the writer, Pat Conroy, who was in Atlanta at the time. I grew up with him. He was a friend of mine. And I had a job that I really liked in a way because I worked with some very talented people. It was a staff development state coordinator for the Learning Institute of North Carolina for North Carolina state job. But it was boring. Watching those talented people that I was responsible for was great. But going to the conferences, doing the talks, all that kind of stuff. I was sitting with I was sitting with doing a workshop one time for teachers. And uh, so there were a couple of first grade teachers there. And part of what I was doing there was learning about early childhood education, watching the people from England who were doing open classrooms then and so forth, so we could transpose some of that to middle schools. And so I'm sitting there and I'm looking at two first grade teachers, and I'm sitting there talking. And of course, I'm telling them everything I know. And apparently, it's very little, Bruce. It's not very much at all because I can see the cynical smiles. So I look at the cynical smiles and I'm thinking to myself, they think I don't know shit. And unfortunately, they happen to be totally correct. I don't. I can't learn enough to teach teachers if I'm not in the classroom doing it myself. All right. So I met with Paul and Pat over at his house. We all got drunk, which was great. And we talked about education. And my daughter Maggie just got a note from his older daughter now, Jessica Conroy, who was probably in the early childhood program back then, or first grade. And Jessica remembered the night that me and Pat and Paul were talking uh, 33 years ago, 34 years ago. And we were in the car, and she was this little girl. And, uh, we played and did things with her and so forth. Then we all got to talking again. And she said that about education and about pedagogy. And we were all three arguing, apparently, about writing about it. Okay. And she said, it was so funny and so interesting and so delightful. But for a 5-year-old, I'd never heard such profanity in my life. And I'm sure we forgot she was there. And uh, uh, it was great hearing from her. And there are going to be so many stories. His memorial service is at the Woodruff Center in Atlanta. Um, uh, Friday at 1 o'clock. I'll be there. And I remember there's so many stories. The agreement was that between me and Paul is I knew I needed to get out of this job after seeing those two first grade teachers implicitly telling me I wasn't worth a crap. Okay. Uh, and I thought, how interesting, you know, they're right. At least I'm listening. And 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 I knew I had to get out of there. So Pat calls and he says, come to this school called Paideia. My kids are here. Barbara, his wife, so forth. It's in Atlanta. And I said, I ain't going to teach under somebody else, Paul. Pat, I've been a school principal at 3 different schools. I'm in a supervisory job now. I certainly make good money. And I don't mind giving up some of the money because I'm miserable. But how much? But I got to be able to do what the hell I want to do. Okay. So he said, we've talked with Paul. You've talked with Paul. He loves your ass. He thinks you're great. Um, I disagree with him, Pat said, but he has a mind of his own. I think you suck, Pat said. But so on my way out, I called Paul and we talked. And I said, here's the whole thing, Paul. Okay. If you are interested and you want me, okay, that's important, but it's not enough. I got to be able to do whatever the hell I want. And you have to remember, and I can't have interference, and I've got to be able to learn, okay, because I don't teach the way I was taught. I teach the way I learned from kids I've taught before, okay, or that I learned on my own. And uh, I'm not going to get what I need through meetings and workshops and conferences and everything else. I'll get it from the kids and their parents and other teachers. And uh, and so uh, uh, I got to be able to do what I want, or I'm not coming. Okay. So he said, he looked at me kind of funny and he said, we're talking junior high kids, right, Bernie? And I said, well, yeah. And he said, well, nobody knows what the hell to do with them anyway. Why not? And later on, of course, she would regret some of that. Um, we would, I mean, we'd go to Hawks games. I just love the guy. Pat did too. Uh, Play basketball together, all of us on Sundays. Um, he he knew what I was doing in my classroom. You know, I taught his kids, and he knew they were getting something special. He knew the other kids were too. And it's not like we wouldn't have arguments and disagreement. We fought like siblings. Okay. Um, uh, and one time he won the day in a discussion about what we were going to do. I was going to do, and he said, "I win," and I said, "Yeah, but Paul, in our relationship, whoever wins loses." You know, because we're too close, and we'll retaliate. There'll be the Viet Cong will become alive, you know, and he agreed with that too. And he, uh, I remember when Hidden Places, our literary magazine, came out from our classroom. My wife and I were teaching together then, and uh, and the community loved it because back then America was open. This is post 60s. You know, this is 1972, 73, I mean. And and of course everybody was open. And you also had all these uh nutcase flakes, you know, like Savananda opened a store in Little Five Points and people were raving about it and they all wore beads and these hippie smocks and so forth, dressed in brown. Nobody had wore bras, you know, which that was nice. But the problem is, I've realized from that, I told Paul, I realized from that, if you go into that store, it is reeking of flatulence, bad breath, and garlic. And it was. And everybody was talking like, do I read you loud and clear? You know, it was that time. It was Flake City in a way. Well, what I was doing and what my wife Martha were doing was totally acceptable because we were really working under the assumption that we'd learned from the kids that It's emotion that drives the cognitive, intellectual, artistic, and creative boat, even the social boat. It's emotion that you've got to get to. What's the problem, you know? And the only people that can answer that question are the kids themselves. If you're writing a story and you ain't got no conflict going on in your whole life, and you've never had a problem in your whole life, and you're buttoned up and perfect, then you're going to be boring and your story's going to be boring. And the speech when you're running for office in class, which they had a Congress and court system, is going to be boring. Everything is going to be boring. It's like I walked by my wife one time and she was at a conference with this kid from Charleston, kind of aristocratic kid, very Southern, very bright. And she said, "Sweetheart, your story is superficial." And so I waited to see what would happen. And so the kid says, "Well, why?" And she said, "Well, sweetheart, because you are." Okay. And from there, they go on to how she was raised. She has a story, what made her this way. What is it she's missing? What is it she's denying? What is she leaving out? And this is the way we're doing. We learn from the kids. Okay. And I knew that each year I would be surprised. What I didn't know is that every day, Bruce, I would be surprised. Either gratefully surprised, worried as hell, you know, moving into action somehow, but they were surprises, every damn one of them. And I loved them. They loved me. We got along great. Now, with Paul, Paul was, it's funny because I was talking with Paul a few months ago, and we were just talking on the phone, keeping in touch. And he had just retired. You know, he was still teaching a class at Paideia, but he'd retired. And I said, Jesus Christ, I hope they get somebody, I hope they got somebody good to replace you because, I mean, that's going to be hell. And he said, I know, Bernie, it's like following Jesus, you know. And I thought about later and how ironical and amusing that was, and self-deprecating it was. I'm a Jew. I don't give a rat's ass about Jesus. Okay. But Jesus was a savior, is the way I've heard it from my Christian Gentile friends. And uh, and I'll have to tell you who my protector was. He was my hero. I got it when we were first there, everything was great. Post 60s, 70s. Everybody wanted to be open, whether we were or not. You certainly weren't going to critique that in a negative way. Open Classrooms in the middle school was my first book by my wife and I. Okay. I had no problem getting it published and out there, whatever, because it was topical. Okay. And by the time we finished it, we'd moved beyond it. And there were a few people who would certainly complain because of the emotional depth and the creative and artistic demands. It was hard work that we had the kids do. And also my profanity. Well, the worst thing in my life is when I discovered in class, the kids just love it when you cuss. They love it. And they absolutely love it. They admire you. They envy you. And it frees them up. In fact, if I have a kid tell me, get really pissed off or frustrated, and we called each other by our first names because the families all knew each other. So the kids called us by our first names. And if a kid finally just broke it out and said, F you, well, I can say fuck here, right? Yeah, fuck you, Bernie. Fuck you. I knew I had him. I knew that whatever was coming, a great speech, a great story, a great discussion, a great and thorough reading of literature and the books we were reading and stories we were reading that weren't offset by their denials and their own traumas so that they couldn't see clearly. I knew they would see. Whatever it was they needed to learn, it came out. All right. Well, of course, At first, this was great. And we had plenty of people who wanted to be in the classroom and so forth. As the times changed, okay, people started, even teachers, you could see them, they started caring about what they wore, for example. I mean, back in the early 70s, you come in there with a t-shirt, Bermudas, and flip-flops and start teaching. All right. And of course, the whole world changed. Well, the better the teaching that I got, and I was better every year because I'd learned so much every year from them. The more I learned, the more trouble threatened on the horizon, like some goddamn vulture. Okay? What's Bertie doing over there? We need to have a secret meeting and get him out. My protector, and I want to tell you, it was controversial. The longer I was there, the more closed society became, I think, as it is now. It was approaching that. And the more conventional people were. The teachers were still vivid. I mean, they were, and the parents of kids in my class, they were vivid. They were out there and they were great. Okay. But around us, it was becoming very conservative. And uh, uh, what they were writing about, the idea that we would be doing all this social and emotional work in a classroom and that it could affect curriculum and academic and intelligence. The people who understood that really bought it. And the parents in the classroom, most of them loved it. Okay. But people out there didn't. And I wasn't very good at explaining it to them because I got where I didn't even know them. My protector and my hero happened to be Jesus. Paul was right. He was absolutely right. He protected me. And he protected me. And I say this as an example of a very good teacher and a very good school. Okay. And he protected me. Uh, he knew he he knew I was getting my hands dirty. You know, I would do anything to make sure a kid was learning and a kid was happy. And we were hard on the kids. They loved us. We were fun. Okay. We were a lot of fun. But our work demands were really hard, very hard. And the kids loved the work, but of course they could get anxious, they could get this, they could say Bernie's working, whatever. Paul, in the same way that I could get my own hands dirty in a progressive middle class school with the emotional work, the social work that affected curriculum, Paul wanted me to do it. No matter, hold on, I'm getting a phone call here. Uh, can you hear my phone ringing? Oh, okay. All right. No matter how much um, uh, controversy it caused, and over the years, the number of people who wanted their kids in the classroom dwindled. I mean, we weren't so as popular because the times were changing and we were doing more. The more we learned, the more we did, sometimes the more controversial it was. Paul wanted me to do it. And here's why. He wanted his kids to get it. And he wanted all the other kids in the school to get it. I would like to say it was for me and our friendship, and there's no question about it. That wasn't the real reason. Paul was the captain of the ship. And Paul wanted these kids to get the best education they could get and have the most fun they could get and work hard. And uh and he was my protector from parents who I didn't know. Usually they were parents I'd never even heard of. There were people outside of the classroom. There was jealousy, there was envy, and there was simply a very shallow, big disagreement about what I was doing with the kids in the classroom from people who'd never been in there mostly. All right. And and I remember one time telling a parent, complaining about it. The next day, Paul gets all these wonderful letters to tell to the board from the parents in the classroom. And it's not all of them, but we had support. What Paul did for me was he created a place where I could work. And that's what he did for the kids. And the reason he did it, even when I disagreed with him, there were times when we'd fight and I'd say, screw you. Okay, I don't like your leave policy. I don't go interfering with that. So what are you doing mucking around with me in my classroom? And Paul is very funny. You know what he said when I told him that? He said, Bernie, what is my leave policy? He knew I had no idea. I had no interest in the administration. I was totally glued in to those kids and other teachers. Uh, and uh, and Paul, he saved me, and he was my hero. And frankly, I hate to sound like a Gentile here, coming from a Yid, it's a little unusual, but he was, ironically, my Jesus. He was a great man, Bruce, a great man, a great educator, great father, great husband. He was just great friend, do anything for you. And he also had this great thing. He's from New England. He wasn't a ingratiating white Southerner, a white Jewish Southerner like me. He uh Paul had that New England reserve, and he could tap into that anytime he wanted to. And he could say no. That's really the way Paul pissed people off when he did. If he was curt or if he would say no, and a lot of people didn't like it. But the difference is Paul was happy. He loved being in school. All the other teachers there, they were happy in school, loved being in school, were good students, all but me. So obviously, my approach was very different from a lot of them. And Paul protected it. He protected it. And I would say he was my Jesus. I also want to tell, to close this out, I want to tell how close and intimate it was. We would play basketball, the faculty, parents, on an outdoor court on Sunday mornings. And it'd be me, Pat, Paul, bunch of us. Some of us pretty good, one or two really great, and some of them not so good. Paul organized these games. He made sure we were out there, and he played. We all played. And uh, and I remember there would be one guy. He was a science teacher. He's a good guy, had a good sense of humor, but he would get so intense and so involved. You could tell he was a high achiever at whatever Ivy League school he went to. And he would do things like, if we were losing the game, he'd do things like, come on, guys, damn it, let's get it together. So we would make fun of it. We would wait for the next play. Oh my God, I fell apart. Okay, excuse me. All right. Now, and me and Paul and Pat would drive there and drive back to the courts together. All right. Now, Paul would be in the back because we let him off. Pat let him off first. Pat was in his yellow Volkswagen. He dropped Paul off and he dropped me off. And so Paul would be in the back, and he's got this basketball and he's twirling it on his finger. And we're all talking, having a good time. And I said, did you notice that said teacher criticizes fucking everybody in this Quakery, self-righteous way? Okay? And neither Italianesque nor Yid. Paul was Italian. All right. And notice that he criticizes everybody except one person. And who do you think that one person is? Okay. Paul's twirling the ball, he's smiling. And Pat yells out, it's because he's got his head up your ass so far, it's coming out of his eyeballs. Okay. All right. And Paul said, I know. Isn't it great? That was Paul. The whole school was like that. Teachers were like that. The whole school was the most irreverent place you've ever seen. And even though I've told the story about maybe me being somewhat controversial as we got older and grew, yeah, the school itself, those people, they loved it. They loved it. And uh, 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 and what Paul wanted was fun and work and humor, irreverence, and he infiltrated the school with all that stuff. Uh, a great man, my great friend, Bruce. I can't help it. He's my hero. And uh, uh, so I want everybody to know about him, and I know they do. They don't need me for it. There'll be 1 million people at that damn memorial service. And there are people who loved him. I had a friend of mine, a former student, Derek Hagman, uh, and he's just retired. And he needed something from Paul. He was calling him to get some help on something. And he said the amount of time that Paul took with him to make sure the obsessiveness Paul had, which I loved, the obsessiveness that he took to help Derek out and give him what he needed, moved Derek to tears. And I think his heroism and his work, I think a lot of people will be crying and weeping. And if they're not, they got problems. Okay. He was great. Yeah. And that's my story about my good friend and hero, Paul Bianchi.